Hello, everyone. Welcome to the channel. Back again with another Ask the Experts panel discussing BizTalk Server migration to Azure Integration Services. My name is Kent Weir. I'm a Principal Product Manager on the Azure Logic Apps team. And today I'm joined by Daniel Probert. Daniel, do you want to just give a brief introduction, please?
Yep, sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Probert or Daniel Probert. I work at a company called Affinis or Affinis. I guess it's like whether you say Azure or Azure. I tend to say Affinis. I'm based in the UK. I'm originally from New Zealand. And I've been working with BizTalk since BizTalk 2000, back in 2002. So I'm the chief technical architect, or chief technical officer, I should say, really, for Affinis. But it just means that I do design and set technical direction and do all things integration, really.
Awesome, and thanks for joining. And Daniel's being a little bit humble here. He definitely is a expert in this space, so it is a pleasure to have him sharing his knowledge here with all of you. He really does know stuff. So let's jump right into it. So previously, just before the holiday break in December, we had published some architecture guidance, and I'll include a link to that in the description. And so I feel like that's a good starting point for people that are interested in this subject. But then what I wanted to do was to bring on these experts, these independent experts that are doing this in their day-to-day lives and really get their perspectives. And so I've got a series of questions here for Daniel. And let's start out with what are some examples of BizTalk migrations that you've been involved in? And what has been the biggest driver for some of these customers?
Wow. Okay. So let's start with the biggest driver because it's an interesting question. A lot of our customers, or almost all of our customers, are all BizTalk customers. We have another number of customers that are new to integration, and they will generally choose Azure. We don't tend to get new customers looking at BizTalk. But predominantly, the biggest driver for most clients is cost. And it's not necessarily real cost, but perceived cost. So they're perceiving that maybe moving to Azure will make things cheaper in the long run. Usually that's because they're coming up to their enterprise agreement renewal date or something like that, and they're looking at the support costs of BizTalk. The number one thing, though, I think, is fear. There's a fear around what the future of BizTalk is going to be. Plus, there's this idea that cloud is new and everyone should be moving to it. And so a lot of companies have a cloud strategy, and they're thinking, well, BizTalk isn't cloud, therefore I need to move to cloud. And Microsoft's direction for integration on cloud is AIS, Azure Integration Services. Um, After cost, I think the next biggest one is generally support for newer technology. And I think it's worth sort of taking a pause here a little bit, Kent, and just talking a little bit about the history of BizTalk and the state of BizTalk today to understand why people might want to migrate. But also a question that I will tend to raise with my clients when they say, oh, we want to migrate to Azure, is I'll just stop them and say, why? Because they need a very solid reason for doing it. Unless BizTalk was sunlighted or sunsetted, today, then other than cost or support for new technologies, there might not be benefits to the client in migrating their existing workloads. But that doesn't mean it's not worth migrating. The main thing we tend to find is clients want to integrate with newer technologies. So maybe they're going to a cloud provider where there's no adapter in BizTalk, or the existing adapters in BizTalk don't work, or something like that. But what you've got to remember is that BizTalk is a very solid, mature product. I started working with BizTalk 2000 back in 2002, and back then we were using it for the EDI accelerator, if you remember those, and using a mainframe adapter. And so we were taking EDI messages in and sending them off to a mainframe, and it was brilliant for that. And companies would choose it because it was cheap. It was a lot cheaper than the comparable offerings from Oracle or IBM or whatever else. But the BizTalk that we tend to use today is pretty much the BizTalk 2004, BizTalk 2006 version, when it switched to .NET Framework with support for orchestrations and C# and Xlang S and all the rest. So even today, BizTalk 2020 is pretty much the same engine, the core engine from 2004, 2006, but with newer adapters and pipeline components and other features. But so it's a mature product. But it does have a very steep learning curve. And, I don't know if you remember the Blogger's Guide to BizTalk back in the day. And
Alan
how
Smith.
yeah, exactly. And Alan Smith, yeah. So, and how difficult BizTalk development was before that, because there was no one place to go to find out how to do things. I remember, it was the Blogger's Guide that taught me about convoys and stuff. And I'm just thinking about a comment that Sandro made 2 weeks ago, or the 2 videos ago, about how he's never implemented a convoy. And I was like, really? Why not? Because I use them quite a lot for the right scenario. They're very, very useful for the right scenario. But the other thing too with BizTalk is, it's almost like the COBOL of our day, in that how many BizTalk developers do you know that are in their 20s? Most BizTalk developers, most of us who are very experienced in BizTalk are pushing 50 nowadays. BizTalk is not cool in the same sort of way. And yet I work with quite a few Logic App developers who are in their 20s, for example, because they've come into it, it's a new technology, they get it, but they don't necessarily have the integration experience. So that's something that when I was hiring BizTalk developers, one of the things I always look for was experience in working with many disparate systems. So, have you worked with Salesforce and Oracle and, SAP and all the rest? Because that would indicate that they had some experience in understanding how those systems work. Because remember, at its core, BizTalk is a way of connecting different systems together, translating between. And that is what BizTalk is absolutely brilliant at. Taking a third-party system which has its own format, transforming that to an XML format. And that's always what it does. Flat file to XML, EDI to XML, whatever to XML, and effectively almost creating a canonical format there. Then we do processing on that and maybe run some rules over it or whatever. And then we go out to another system again, and we translate to whatever format that system is. So if it's SAP, we're using BAPI and iDocs and things like that, and that's what BizTalk is fantastically good at, that mapping. So I think we also have to remember that BizTalk as a product does a lot of things in one box. When we install it, we get PubSub, we get workflows in orchestrations, we get APIs, believe it or not. If you create a receive location, it's effectively a SOAP-based API. We get really good exception handling. How often do you use a scope inside an orchestration and have good exception handling? Or the fact that with failed message routing, we get a copy of the message and everything like that. We get throttling. So that's something that I don't know how many people use, and it's much easier to use now than it used to be when it was hidden in registry settings and the like. But we can start throttling host instances and everything else, and we get suspend and resume other sorts. The ESB toolkit brought us itineraries, which is absolutely brilliant for implementing a routing slip pattern of some sort, logging, EDI, pipelines, transforms. There was a really good adapter marketplace, not so much now, but you could go and find adapters for almost any system, a PDF adapter. I mean, cool, awesome stuff. WCF support was always the biggest thing. If you think about it, WCF support was probably the biggest thing that we got out of BizTalk at the time. If you wanted to do Dubber security or Dubber star of some sort, it's all there. It's difficult to configure, but you had that support, and it was customizable with custom bindings and things like that. Large file support. This is something I noticed has been talked about on a number on all these videos. Buffering versus chunking and the like. Or buffering versus streaming. That yes, BizTalk and the way it handles its pipelines in a streaming fashion means that I can read in a 2 gig file and stream through it with my, chaining together all my pipeline components to read every byte as it gets pulled through. That's absolutely brilliant for when you're dealing with large files. But BizTalk, didn't have a good admin story. That's why BizTalk 360 was created, as far as I'm aware. So there wasn't a good admin story for teams and managing the permissions and like. There was never a very good monitoring or alerting story. Again, BizTalk 360 came in to fill that gap. There wasn't a deployment story at all originally. I mean, BizTalk deployment framework really, really helped with that. And then some of the newer feature packs added stuff in. But to the point now where actually deploying BizTalk using, say, a DevOps pipeline isn't too bad. It's complex, but it works, and it works really well. And there's never been a very good sort of testing story. I mean, this is a classic one. BizUnit, you know, Kevin Smith and BizUnit was created to enable, I wouldn't even call them unit tests, they're integration tests. So they test, you know, a flow or an integration flow as a whole. So that, you know, the thing about BizTalk is it implements a large number of enterprise integration patterns. That's really what it's good at. And yet when we go to Azure, we've got all these disparate services. So most people think, well, you're going from BizTalk to what? To Logic Apps? Well, you're not. You're going to Logic Apps and functions and API management and service bus and app configuration and Key Vault and SQL Server. And maybe Data Factory, all those different services together give you, at a minimum, what BizTalk does in one box. They do more, but at a minimum, that's you've got to use all those different technologies. So when we talk about migrating, it's never a simple story. We do a lot of work with higher education. So in those cases, migrating is slightly more tricky because education sector get a very, very good discount on BizTalk. So they pay a lot less for BizTalk than, say, you know, an enterprise client would generally. So there's less of a factor on cost being the driver for a migration. Instead, what tends to drive migration is lack of support for newer technologies. I mean, take OAuth flows, for example. You know, if I want to talk to Salesforce from BizTalk using OAuth, I have to write a custom extension for WCF. That's the only way to do it. There's no built-in adapter support for that. And then I'm back to supporting my own code. You know, it's quite a complex thing to do, but you can do it. JSON support is interesting as well. If you think about, there's been a change in architectural patterns over the years. We've gone away from SOAP and XML towards REST and JSON. You know, and you see that in Logic Apps today. It's JSON as its default language, you know, internally, regardless of what you send it. BizTalk, it's XML. And even though, you know, in BizTalk, was it BizTalk 2016 when we got the, might have been 2013 R2, where we got the JSON encoder and decoder pipeline components, you know, and they use Newtonsoft's JSON.NET under the covers and do effectively a 2XML or a 2JSON. But the JSON you get is not clean. It's, you know, because of the fact that the expectation is that you will go back to the XML eventually, you have to include all the namespaces. You have to indicate whether the data you got was from an attribute, you know, was it from an element on a text record or something like that, you know. So all that is included. So your JSON's quite messy and quite difficult to parse inside a Logic app or inside anything that parses JSON. So BizTalk's beginning to show its age because of that. And I think that when we're talking about migration is what we're looking at, that a lot of companies now, when they're thinking about migrating to a new system or integrating with a new system, are thinking, well, BizTalk isn't the first choice anymore. It used to be, but now it's like, well, I could do it in BizTalk, but it's probably going to be easier to do it in Azure. And because cloud has become the place to go for almost every company, it makes sense to put it there. If you're putting all your workload in cloud anyway, and you have your subscriptions set up and you've got VMs running and various app services running, then it's a no-brainer to start putting integration up there. What we tend to recommend for clients, though, especially clients that currently have BizTalk and have workloads on BizTalk, is to look at a hybrid bus. And I know Sandro talked a little bit, or might have been Mike actually talked a little bit about in the early days doing hybrid connectivity. We tend to say, well, if you think about BizTalk as an ESB, and then you think about AIS and creating an ESB up there, what you can actually do is say, I'm going to take everything that gets published to BizTalk and publish it up to Service Bus, for example. So just a like for like. And that way, all your services that subscribe to stuff in BizTalk could also subscribe to stuff up in Azure. And then you can start adding in new services or new applications, the equivalent of a BizTalk application up in Azure, that can subscribe to those messages. Then they can do something with it. And when they publish a message, then you have a bidirectional send back to BizTalk. And then your existing BizTalk applications can subscribe to that. And what we tend to find in the migration story is we don't have to do it in one big bang. We don't have to say we're moving all your applications off BizTalk in one go. Instead, what we will do is we will migrate them bit by bit. Often there's a bit of fear around migration. Azure adds a lot of unknowns for companies. This was brought up last week when we started to, when governance was being talking about, governance is a really important thing. The number of clients I've seen who have been bitten by large bills. I know of one client, not our client, but they decided to do some load testing on Logic App's consumption. So they dropped in, I don't know, a couple 100,000 messages because they wanted to see what would happen under load, without realizing that, of course, you don't really need to load test. The infrastructure is managed by Microsoft. You can trust the SLAs with that. But also, if you drop in a couple 100,000 messages, you'll pay for it. So there was a very large bill at the end of it. So it's kind of a paradigm shift in how you think about your applications. But the thing I would say about integration and BizTalk to Azure is the integration patterns are the same. So we did some early work on trying to automate, the process of migration, and most of that was based upon looking at instead of a like for like, lift and shift what you've got. Look at the problem you're trying to solve, break it down to a series of enterprise integration patterns, and then implement those in whatever technology you're using. So, if I have a convoy pattern, then in BizTalk, then I wouldn't try and implement that in exactly the same way in Azure, but I could implement something that, performs a similar task. And I think for a lot of companies, what we tend to recommend for migration is that you look at your new applications first. You look at a new integration and you do that in Azure, because then you're not bringing across anything you used to have. If you don't have any new integrations, then take a fairly simple BizTalk application and look at migrating that first, especially if you haven't got any experience in Azure, because there's a lot of new things. So if we think about moving to Azure or deploying an integration solution in Azure, before you can even get to that point, you need to understand Azure Active Directory and authentication. You need to understand subscriptions and how you manage those. I think it was Rick last week who talked about separating out your production and your development subscriptions. Incredibly important, but you've got to know that. Someone's got to have told you. You need to understand what RBAC is and how you apply it, so you can control who has access to your subscriptions and who can do what. What's your monitoring story going to look like? Are you happy with log analytics and Azure, the Azure monitoring solutions? Do you need a third-party tool like Serverless 360 or something? What does your governance look like? Who are your governance teams? How do they get alerted for certain things? Governance is really, really important. And inside that, you have things like billing. So this is probably the number one concern I see with all our clients, which is how will they know how much it's going to cost? And how do you handle splitting the billing? So, and this is an interesting one actually that we could spend time on, but in a nutshell, when you've got multiple different projects who are funded by different business units, BizTalk tends to be a finite cost. It's CapEx. You've come in and you've paid for it at the beginning, and yes, there might be an ongoing cost, but it's not like a monthly cost that you've then got to disperse out to different departments. How do you handle that from a billing point of view? Then there's alerting as well. So what is your alerting today? What's your monitoring solution look like today for alerting on things and who needs to know? DevOps is a whole new one. So getting your head around ARM templates or Bicep or whatever, that's an incredibly complex thing to start looking at. The number of clients I've seen that have gone, oh, this Logic App stuff is really easy, and they've gone into the portal and have created a Logic App. And that's it. They've done. That's their production code all ready to go. And they're like, well, how do we automate the deployment of this? I'm like, well, okay, that's a whole separate story. Configuration, where do we store our configuration? We've got key vault and app config and things like that, and then data management as well. So anyway, the point being is that there's a lot to learn when it comes to migrating a BizTalk application. So I guess the thing that we find that the drivers tend to be people feeling that BizTalk is eventually going to disappear, and they want to move to the cloud. I think it would be an easier decision if we could run AIS on-prem. And that was always the dream of first Azure Stack and then containerization. And it's more likely with Logic App Standard being able to run on a container. If I could have a series of applications, or an integration application that's made up of many different parts, and I could choose to deploy that to the Azure cloud or to my own cloud running locally, and then I could choose my costing and my billing and my alerting and all the rest of it based on that. But the one thing I would say is that when we look at migrating, the thing we tend to say to our clients is that the problems you face in developing a BizTalk solution are the same problems you will face in developing an Azure integration solution. Yeah, integration problems are the same. Take mapping, for example. I'm always a big believer that you do your mapping as early as possible, because it's the one thing that will bite you further down. If you just make an assumption that your mapping from one format to another is easy, and you do your development and your estimation and things like that, and then during development you discover that actually one of these fields that maps to another needs a lookup, and that lookup data comes from a third-party system you've got to make a call out to. Now suddenly you've blown out your budget and everything, and you would know that if you did your mapping up front. And if you can reuse your assets, so this is something I know that's very dear to your heart, the idea of taking existing BizTalk assets and reusing them up in Azure. So the story for that is getting better. It was very difficult for us to recommend that people take their existing BizTalk maps, which are XSLT under the covers, and reuse those in Azure, because there was too much work needed. You couldn't support third-party assemblies, and a lot of people use those. You had to do work to a map before you could upload it. In an ideal world, you want to be able to say, here's my BTM file, which is a BizTalk map file, and stick that directly in my Logic app in the artifacts folder along with some assemblies, and it would just auto magically work. That's the dream.
And that dream's not too far away. Yeah, no, it's on the train actually. So yeah, we did announce public preview back in November about support for .NET Framework assemblies plus XSLT, but you had to make a few tweaks to it. You had to add some references to the assembly in the XSLT file, and then now what's coming is support for extension objects, so that when you're in BizTalk and you validate a map and it generates the XSLT that you would typically upload into your Logic App Standard instance, is now you'll also get, it shows up in the BizTalk output console, that a small XML file that basically is metadata for your assembly. And we're going to include that in the action itself, the transform XML action. You'll just copy and paste that content in, and basically it just works.
Nice.
I've tried it. I've got a video in the queue. So folks, shameless plug, do look on the channel. Depends when you see this video, but that should be up on the channel in the not too distant future. So I guess one thing that I just wanted to sort of recap some of the things you said there, because there's a lot to unpack and a lot of goodness there. I think the one thing that you started with, which is super important, is the why. A customer should understand the why, and it is something that they should track as part of their project. And because I think what you want to be able to do is to go back to your stakeholders, someone's going to fund this project, and you want to be able to go, did we achieve what we set out to achieve? Yes or no? And I think as you're going through the migration project itself, being able to check those boxes off, I feel is really important, because you don't want to do this for the sake of doing it. There should be a driver. And I think you mentioned a lot. You mentioned skill set, I think is something that does come up a fair bit. Let's be honest, a lot of the BizTalk specialists have either retired or they've pivoted to new careers. Some of those folks are working in Azure Integration Services themselves, and they prefer to work up there with the more modern technology stack. And I think that is should be a legitimate concern for customers, is how do we sort of maintain what we have and make sure it's operationally. And then I think it's also about giving folks career paths too, right? Where they feel hey, I'm working on stuff that is is in demand and that there's more people that are interested in it. And so I think that's quite important as well. I think the patterns, and this is something I borrowed from you before, as we've chatted like a lot in the past, where it's like the integration problems haven't changed, but the middleware or the integration platforms have.
The tools
And I've shamelessly borrowed that when I've had discussions with engineering, and people are like, well, like, is it still relevant? And I'm like, of course it is. Like, the need is still relevant to solve a particular integration problem. The way you do it might be a little bit different. And I think that's where we're trying to bring resources that help with that mental mapping. And, I think the architecture guidance document, we try to do that where we build out a sort of a visual that says like, hey, these are typically the tools or approaches that you use to solve that problem in BizTalk. This is where you should start looking in terms of AIS, Azure Integration Services, or just Azure in general, because I think you're right. Like, there is some complementary technologies in Azure to AIS that you need to know. And you mentioned a lot of those, like Azure Active Directory, the RBAC models, the billing models, really a lot of governance best practices. And I think there's some good things there. Now, one other, I guess, plug is Daniel and team were part of the AIS landing zone work that we recently published as well. And I feel like that would be a good opportunity for customers that might want to understand what an enterprise deployment might look like as a way to sort of see some of these concepts in action, where you talk about like network segmentation and how do I set up my logging or my monitoring inside of Azure as well. So we'll include a link in the description, and people can go ahead and take a look at that.
And I was going to say, Kent, just around that landing zone, it's probably worth saying that there are two parts to that. The landing zone, there's the documentation that tells you effectively what do I need to consider for all the different technologies involved in Azure Integration Services, but also where do I go to find out more information? So it's primarily lots and lots of links to Microsoft Learn documents. And then the second part is that single click deploy to Azure, or click to deploy, which is a series of ARM templates today that will set up a full integration solution for you, all connected up with virtual networking and everything else, to give you an idea of what the recommended practice from Microsoft is. It's a tricky one because everyone's got different requirements, so it's quite hard to have something that fits everyone. But I think it's what Microsoft have done, and obviously we've helped in a bit, is create something that's a great starting place.
Absolutely. And I think that's especially for folks that might be new to Azure, where they're kind of like, how do I know that I'm sort of deploying these other services, and how do I know that I'm doing it right? So that's the goal, is having some guidance. You make a good point. Like, customers may have some different opinions about how to solve things depending upon like their scale and their maturity. And so there might be some optionality that people need to sort of look at, but I think it's a great starting point. And it's something where you can, click a button and have like a full connected environment in around an hour. And I think it saves you a lot of like reading time. Obviously, you want to sort of look at it and understand it, but in terms of saving you, it's kind of like the Coles Notes version, where you can sort of get started quite quickly. One question I wanted to talk a little bit about was, we talked about reusable components inside of BizTalk. Now, if you were going to look at those reusable components, and maybe it's logging, maybe it's some sort of like helper or lookups. We talked about that, reference data, maybe. Like, if you were looking at that from a BizTalk perspective, and now you're going into Azure, like, how would you think about reuse in the cloud? Like, what would be some ideas or patterns that you would want to take advantage of in the cloud as it pertains to reuse?
Oh, good question. So reuse, there are certain components that you can just reuse out of the box. And we've just talked about maps. And a lot of, at least our clients, but a lot of the organizations I've worked with have got a lot of work or investment in maps and schemas and the like. And even though Logic Apps is predominantly JSON based, the systems they're integrating with might still be XML, so they'd like to reuse those. Flat file maps are a classic example. Generating a flat file schema in BizTalk is a skill in of its own. It's a lost art in a lot of ways when I go back and see some of the ones I used to do. And you can do a lot of things with them. We did integration with the mainframe because the adapter for, I can't remember which IBM mainframe it was so expensive that we worked out that all it really did was use flat files. So we use the flat file adapter to create the messages and send them directly to the mainframe. So there's a lot of power there, and you can reuse those out of the box as they are. So definitely maps and schemas are right up there for things you can use. Along with helper files or helper assemblies that are used in maps. So that's quite a big one. So, what we call extensions in XSLT. As long as they're not doing database lookups or referencing a third-party assembly, then they're generally very, very useful, and you can bring them up. The other reusable components are trickier to handle. I mean, how many, almost everyone will have written a pipeline component of some sort, like an archiver or something like that. They're harder to justify because there's no like for like. You have to write something up in Azure for that. One of the things we looked at in our early work on automating the migration of BizTalk to Azure was, could we reuse C# class? Could we use helper assemblies from an orchestration? So could I take an orchestration and look at all the expression shapes in it and find a way of bringing those into an Azure function? Because it's just C# code or .NET Framework code. So if you've got an assembly, we can call into that from a function. So again, it depends what it does. If the function is self-contained, or even if the function is calling out to SQL, you can do that still. If you're using ADO.NET, you could just change the connection string so it goes to Azure SQL, for example. So there's certain types of reusable components you can bring up. Other things are trickier. Business rules engine support is something we've talked about for a long time, and I know it would make some people's jobs easier if we could bring that up. Trading partner management, I mean, that's something that was very early on was supported in even BizTalk Services and is in integration accounts and consumption. I don't know what state it's in at the moment for standard, but there's tooling around to help you migrate those things. But it depends what you mean by a reusable component. When you say reusable component, I'm thinking of something that someone has built, and it's generally a .NET assembly. It's custom code that someone has written, either because it's a custom adapter, or it's a pipeline component, or it's a WCF extension, or it's code that you're calling from an orchestration. And I would generally say that code you're calling from an orchestration you can reuse. You can bring that assembly up and you can reference it from a .NET function, and you can call the function from your logic app. I mean, in an ideal world, given that you're in a function anyway, you'd be able to reference C# directly in an assembly and all the rest of that. But you can do it today, as long as that code that you've got will run in Azure without needing additional assemblies or connections to systems, that sort of thing. Pipeline components, WCF extensions, forget it. There's no point. There's nothing up in Azure that's going to run them. However, what they do can be recreated. Archiving, for example. If you've got an archiving component, as you bring in a flat file into BizTalk, you archive it off somewhere. You can do that just with another logic app you're calling out and doing whatever. There are ways around these things, but you can't bring them as a whole. Where I think people will get tripped up a little bit is when you're using a custom adapter, or you're using an adapter where there's no equivalent in Azure as well. So those are custom components that you'll have to probably write yourself. And in those cases, I'm all over API management. I mean, I usually say that API management, if you're talking about integration in Azure, the two technologies you want to use are API management and logic apps, closely followed by service bus. Those three, really, they're the triumvirate. I mean, functions as well is down there as well, but that's where you're bringing your stuff into, because a lot of the stuff you do, even a custom adapter, you can replicate in API management. It's such an incredibly powerful tool. And I say to all my clients when we're migrating, always put API management in front of your logic apps, always. Use it like Azure Front Door, stick it in front of your logic apps, and even between your logic apps, between your workflows. If it makes sense, put API management in there, because then you can mock things out. If you want to go to a third-party system and there's not a built-in connector for it, use API management. So it's, yeah. In terms of other reusable components, I'm not really sure. I can't think. I mean, business rules engine, trading partner, There's not much else that we would look at bringing from BizTalk. Because once you've got your schemas and your maps, and there's good support for those, and the assemblies that go along with those, then it's assemblies you call from your orchestrations. And other than that, there's not a lot else I can think of that you might bring up, unless you've
Yeah.
worked with something.
No, I think you checked a lot of the boxes I was looking for. I certainly didn't want to lead you there, but yeah, and I think there's some good news coming on the calling custom code
Yeah.
from Logic App workflow itself. So as you rightfully stated, today Azure Functions, you can go ahead and do that. There's a connector for Azure Functions, and you can write that code and basically call it, and life's good. We are working on a more native experience, and with the use case around BizTalk migration, or that's the driver for this, and so you will be able to go ahead and call custom.NET code from a code action in your Logic app itself. And it's really like that work that I talked about before of supporting the .NET framework inside of XSLT maps.
Yeah.
We enabled under the hood something called a multi-language worker. And that really unlocked the door for us in terms of even additional capabilities. And so by the time people see this video, we'll be in a private preview. So if folks are interested in this capability, do reach out, and I'll have a chat with you about that. And the goal is that you would be able to create like a function project that would be a .NET framework template, and would have a specific trigger action on it that would allow you to write .NET Framework up to 4.7.2 or reference other .NET Framework up to 4.7.2 assemblies as well, and be able to deploy that as part of your Logic App project. So that's another kind of late breaking, look under the hood as well. And I think the other piece, which I think you nailed, was API management. I feel like that's another opportunity, and I totally agree around like, if you have an externally facing Logic app, it should be protected by APIM. I think prior to me joining Microsoft, when I ran a team that was using AIS, that was one of our principles, one of our standards. You always included APIM in front of it. And then I think what you brought up around using Azure API management like in between or internally is also quite valuable. And I've seen a lot of other customers do that as well, where you now almost create a bit of a catalog. Where it's like, hey, these are all of the APIs that exist in my organization. There's benefits of being able to do that. You get telemetry around it, some dashboards, some portals. There's an onboarding experience, mocking, as you mentioned, and it's just some decoupling. Like you've got some levels of indirection as well, right? So I think that's another great point as well from that perspective. Now, another question is, we've talked about like what are the good things that people should be doing. Now, what are some things like anti-patterns or things that customers should avoid or rethink as they think about BizTalk, moving BizTalk architectures up to the cloud?
Large files. Do not bring your clunky receive pipeline that takes a 2 gig zip file and parses it. Yeah, don't do that. For many reasons. There are other ways of handling that. Mainly, I'm looking at Azure Data Factory and things like that. But don't try and do that in Logic Apps. I guess that, but that's not a reason not to do it. It's just don't think about what you're doing.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's the anti-patterns really are don't assume that just because you've done something a certain way in BizTalk, you have to do it in the same way. So be prepared to re-architect it and go back and look at how you're doing it. A lot of companies are wedded to the fact that something's worked for many years. And I remember I worked for a very large company, and they had a situation where they had thousands of BizTalk applications, but no automated testing, which meant that even when they went from one version of BizTalk to another, they had to manually run all their tests, which is hugely expensive. And because of that, they don't really want to re-architect those solutions when they come up to Azure, because they want to use their existing test scripts. Even though it's not automated, they at least have manual test scripts. And that kind of, to my mind, it's that case. They're not seeing the forest for the trees. They're so focused on the small things. They're not stepping back to look at the bigger issues they've got there. One of the things I'd say is that a lot of the issues that we solved in BizTalk, we need to resolve in Azure. So take throttling or queuing. Throttling is hard in BizTalk. It's hard in AIS. There are multiple ways of solving it. one of the issues we have with, say, logic apps today is, let's say I think about dumping 100,000 messages in Service Bus and having a workflow with a trigger, Service Bus trigger on there. I'll get a lot of instances. I think it's 5,000 instances will start up all at the same time to start processing it. It's hard to do a throttling pattern, without understanding how it works and what technology you used to use. Restarting checkpoints, replaying messages, things like that were tricky to do in BizTalk, are easier to do in Azure, but you still need to do a bit of work. And the classic one also is low latency, high throughput. So, that's an anti-pattern, if you like. But in BizTalk, if you wanted to do low latency, you tune it so that it's polling the BizTalk database quickly.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
You remember that? But you do that at the cost of high throughput, because now you've got an extra load on your SQL Server, so you couldn't handle as many messages. So you had to have a choice. That problem kind of goes away. Definitely went away with consumption, but it reintroduces itself with Logic App Standard, because there's a limit in your app service plan to how much resource you've got for running the workflow orchestrator and queuing up all those workflows and everything like that. So it's a learning curve, basically, is what I'm getting at around it. I guess the thing is anti-patterns. There's probably a lot of things. I'm aware that we've got limited time now, but there's probably a lot of things that you shouldn't bring from your BizTalk days. But I think if you look at how and why you've done something, if you look at the why and you go, well, actually, the reason we did it is still valid, then it's probably valid to bring up into Azure and even implement it in a similar way. And you might decide to implement it in a way that's not ideal in Azure, but you do for now, whilst you look at re-architecting it later. But yeah, there's quite a few anti-patterns that I can't think of off the top of my head, actually, that I would say you don't really want to bring, but large file support's definitely one of them. And huge schemas. I'm looking at you, SAP, the SAP adapter, and the massive schemas it brings through. The SAP connector that David Berg's done a lot of work on is incredible in terms of its support for SAP. It's so much nicer than working with the SAP adapter and BizTalk. The last thing I would say that no one has talked about is Host Integration Server. The biggest thing for BizTalk is its mainframe support. It's absolutely incredible. And that's one thing that I do know various clients have said, how are we going to handle mainframe support in Azure? That's a good question. I'll hand that one over to Microsoft.
Yeah, no, that's good. And it's, maybe that's an opportunity to have another episode around this, because we do have a PM Harold that is taking care of this area. And I know that we do have some investments coming around mainframe connectors and being able to take advantage of standard and obviously the connectivity. But obviously mainframes generally live on premises, so you kind of have to sort of balance some of that cloud connectivity with like premises processing needs. But I'm not as familiar with this space, but I do know we have someone on the team that is actively managing this. But awesome. I know we're pretty much at time, so I do want to thank you, Daniel. Great conversation. As people can see, tremendous amount of depth here in the conversation. A lot of great advice. If people want to reach out to you, what are the best ways in order to do so?
LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm at Probert Daniel. LinkedIn's Probert Daniel as well, I think, actually, or Daniel Probert. Or just email me, dan.probert@afinis.com. I'm sure Kent will put the details on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll put those in the description of the video. So thanks again, Daniel. I really appreciate it. And it was great having you on the channel today.
No worries at all. Thanks for your time. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.